For the past 75 years, NATO has been the shield protecting Europe, with America as its strongest pillar. But with Donald Trump's return, everything is about to change. Trump has openly declared that America should walk away from NATO, calling it obsolete and unnecessary. His blunt response to the Ukrainian president and the heated exchange with Zelensky have sent shockwaves across European leadership. Germany's new chancellor has also hinted at breaking free from American influence, fueling speculation that NATO might be nearing its end. But here's the million-dollar question. If America pulls out of NATO, can Europe defend itself against Russia? During a press conference, Trump directly asked the UK Prime Minister, "Can the UK fight Russia without America?" And UK's Prime Minister simply responded with a laugh.
Could you take on Russia by yourselves?
Well...
But is it really impossible for the UK, Germany and France to build a military that is strong enough to stand without America? And let's not forget the biggest question. What happens to the United States if it leaves NATO? For decades, America has relied on NATO for its military operations. Whether in Afghanistan, Iraq or Libya, NATO has always been America's frontline force. So if the US leaves NATO, will it still have the power to fight alone in other conflicts? And what about China? Won't it seize this opportunity to shift the global balance if America leaves NATO? America's Arctic strategy also depends heavily on NATO. If the alliance crumbles, who will take control of the Arctic? In today's video, we're diving deep into the potential downfall of the world's most powerful military alliance, a collapse that could shake the global order and bring the world back to the uncertainty it faced after World War II. Once again, I would request you all to please subscribe this channel. This is the only thing I ask of you, as it will keep me motivated to bring more quality videos for you. Let's first understand how and why NATO was created and how it became so dependent on the United States. After World War II, Europe was weak and the Soviet Union was expanding its influence. To stop this, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, NATO, was formed on April 4th, 1949. The goal was simple. If one NATO country was attacked, all members would defend it. From the start, the United States took the lead by providing military leadership, nuclear protection, and financial support. The Cold War made NATO even more important, as the US built permanent military bases across West Germany, Italy, and the United Kingdom to counter the Soviet threat. Over time, many European countries reduced their own military spending, relying more and more on American protection. In 1991, the Soviet Union collapsed, and many believed NATO was no longer needed. But instead of dissolving, NATO expanded. Basically, many former Soviet-controlled countries in Eastern Europe wanted to join NATO for protection. These countries had lived under Soviet influence for decades and feared that Russia might try to dominate them again. So in 1999, Poland, Hungary, and the Czech Republic joined, bringing NATO closer to Russia. This expansion continued in 2004, when Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania became members, pushing NATO right up to Russia's borders. Russia saw this as a direct threat, arguing that the West had broken a promise made at the end of the Cold War not to expand NATO eastwards. The biggest turning point came in 2008, when NATO promised that Ukraine and Georgia could also join in the future. This enraged Russia, which saw NATO moving too close. That same year, Russia invaded Georgia, showing that it would not tolerate NATO's expansion. In 2014, Russia also took over Crimea, further increasing tensions with NATO. In response, NATO deployed more troops and missile defense systems in Eastern Europe, and the United States remained the alliance's backbone, providing most of the military funding and troops. During Barack Obama's presidency, the US tried to balance NATO's expansion without provoking Russia too much. While Obama increased NATO's military presence in Eastern Europe, he also privately assured Moscow that Ukraine would not be allowed to join. However, when Joe Biden took office in 2021, he changed this approach. The US began openly supporting Ukraine's NATO membership, sending billions of dollars in military aid. At the same time, Finland and Sweden also applied to join NATO in 2022, which further increased Russia's fears. Seeing NATO grow stronger, Russia launched a full-scale invasion of Ukraine on February 24, 2022, arguing that NATO was threatening its security. This war completely changed NATO's role. Instead of just being a defensive alliance, NATO started directly supplying weapons and training to Ukraine, making it one of the biggest military conflicts involving the alliance. Now, despite being so powerful and large, NATO relies heavily on the United States for leadership, funding, and military strength. To put in context, as of 2023, the US alone contributed nearly 70% of NATO's total defense spending, making it the largest financial supporter of the alliance. Many European countries, especially Italy, Germany, and France had significantly reduced their military budgets after the Cold War, assuming that US protection would always be available. Beyond funding, the US also maintains a massive military presence in Europe. As of 2023, around 100,000 US troops are stationed across NATO territories, with large bases in Germany, Italy, Poland, and the United Kingdom. The US also provides critical military support that many NATO members lack. This includes advanced missile defense systems like the Patriot and Aegis Ashore, which help protect European cities from potential missile attacks. The US also supplies cutting-edge fighter jets, such as the F-35, F-16, and F-15. In terms of nuclear deterrence, some experts estimate that around 100 US nuclear bombs are stationed in NATO countries like Germany, Belgium, Italy, the Netherlands, and Turkey. Similarly, America also helps the NATO army track enemy movements and intercept their communications through spy satellites and drones. But with Donald Trump back in power, a seismic shift is coming. Donald Trump has repeatedly criticized NATO, arguing that European countries do not contribute their fair share to the alliance. He has stated that if NATO members fail to increase their defense spending, he might withdraw US support or even leave the alliance entirely. Now, without America, NATO would lose nearly 70% of its total defense spending, along with its nuclear deterrence and rapid deployment forces, which have protected Europe for decades. So if we exclude America's defense spending and just take into account Europe's defense budget, the stats are as follows. Europe's combined defense spending in 2024 was $457 billion. And if you calculate Russia's defense spending, after taking into account the purchasing power parity, the Kremlin's military budget racks up to a staggering $461.6 billion. So for the first time ever, Russia is outspending all of Europe in military budget. What makes this even more alarming is that Russia operates under a single command and speaks one language, while European armies are divided, follow different commands, and speak multiple languages. Similarly, to match the combat strength of 100,000 US troops, Europe would need to significantly increase its military power. In simple terms, this would require adding around 50 fully equipped brigades, which means thousands of tanks, armoured vehicles, and heavy artillery. On paper, Europe, including the UK, has about 1.47 million active duty military personnel, which seems like a huge force. But the reality is more complicated. These troops are spread across 28 different national armies, each with its own leadership, command structure, and military priorities. Unlike the US military, which operates under a single unified command, European armies are led by different military generals from their respective countries, each making independent decisions. This means that instead of having one unified strategy, every country follows its own military plans, uses different equipment, and operates under separate chains of command. So the combat power of 100,000 well-equipped and highly coordinated US troops is far greater than the same number of European troops spread across multiple countries. Another example of massive logistical gap is that to stop a fast-moving Russian advance in the Baltics, NATO would require at least 1,400 tanks, 2,000 infantry fighting vehicles, and 700 artillery units, a force larger than the combined armies of France, Germany, Italy, and the UK. Similarly, if the US were to dismantle its 6 nuclear bases in Europe, it would leave a massive gap in Europe's defence. French President Macron and Germany's likely next Chancellor, Friedrich Merz, are already discussing the possibility of sharing nuclear capabilities. This could even mean storing French nukes on German soil, aiming to create a European nuclear shield independent of the United States. But building a credible nuclear deterrent takes time, and in the short term, Europe simply can't replace the security provided by the US nuclear presence. If NATO are to replace US, they would need to build a more unified European military force. But this would require years of investment, political agreements, and structural reforms, none of which can happen overnight. Now let's talk about what will happen to America if it walks away from NATO. For years, the US has led the alliance, using it as a powerful tool to project its military strength across the world. Whether it was the war in Afghanistan, the invasion of Iraq, or the intervention in Libya, the NATO forces played a major role alongside US troops. NATO provided soldiers, air support, and logistical help, allowing the US to spread the burden of war across multiple allied countries instead of fighting alone. If the US leaves NATO, it would lose this backing from European allies in future wars. In Afghanistan, for example, countries like the UK, Germany, and France deployed thousands of troops, shared intelligence, and provided air support. If the US had fought that war alone, it would have required even more American troops, more spending, and a higher risk of casualties. Another major advantage of NATO is its network of military bases and supply routes spread across Europe and the Middle East. Right now, the US relies on key NATO bases in Germany, Italy, Turkey, and the UK to station troops, launch air missions, and transport supplies to conflict zones. zones. For example, Ramstein Air Base in Germany serves as a critical hub for US military operations in the Middle East and Africa. Similarly, Incirlik Air Base in Turkey has been essential for launching airstrikes in Syria and Iraq. If the US leaves NATO, it risks losing access to these bases, making future military operations more difficult, expensive, and slower to execute. Instead of quickly deploying forces through established NATO infrastructure, the US would have to rely solely on its own bases or negotiate new agreements with individual countries, which could take time and political bargaining. Wars are not just about military strength, they require strategic positioning, alliances, and coordinated efforts. So without NATO, the US would still be powerful, but it would have to carry the entire burden of global conflicts alone. And this is where America's Arctic strategy becomes even more crucial. If NATO dissolves or weakens under Trump, one of the most vulnerable and strategically important battlefronts for the United States will be the Arctic. The Arctic is rapidly becoming a major zone of geopolitical competition, with Russia aggressively expanding its military presence and China making moves to establish influence in the region. The Arctic is not just a frozen wasteland, it holds vast untapped oil, gas, and mineral reserves, and as climate change melts the ice, new shipping routes are opening up. Whoever controls the Arctic will have a major advantage in global trade, military strategy, and resource extraction. Currently, NATO provides America with a strong Arctic alliance, mainly through Canada, Norway, Greenland, and Iceland. However, if NATO dissolves, America will have to rethink its entire Arctic strategy, as it will no longer have the support of these allies. Right now, Russia has the strongest military presence in the Arctic. It has built over 50 Arctic military bases, established the world's largest fleet of icebreakers, over 40 in total, and has also deployed nuclear-powered submarines and bombers in the region. Russia's Northern Fleet, a special military unit designed specifically for Arctic warfare, gives it a strategic advantage. The US, in comparison, has significantly fewer resources in the region, with only 2 operational icebreakers and a handful of Arctic military bases, mainly in Alaska. The US would have to invest heavily in new icebreakers to increase its ability to patrol Arctic waters, which are becoming more navigable due to melting ice. Additionally, the US Navy would need to increase submarine patrols in Arctic waters to deter Russian and Chinese encroachment. Diplomatically, without NATO, the United States would need to forge direct security agreements with Arctic allies like Canada, Norway, and Denmark. One possible solution could be the creation of a new Arctic Defence Pact, separate from NATO, to ensure military cooperation among key Arctic nations. Beyond military considerations, the US would also need to expand its Arctic infrastructure and resource extraction projects. With Russia aggressively claiming Arctic oil and gas reserves, the US would have to ramp up its own Arctic drilling and mining operations to maintain economic and energy dominance in the region. More Arctic ports, military installations, and research facilities would be necessary to establish long-term control over key Arctic territories. Additionally, the US would need to counter China's increasing influence in the region. Although China is not an Arctic nation, it has declared itself a near-Arctic state and has been heavily investing in Arctic trade routes, infrastructure, and resource extraction projects. So the collapse of NATO would introduce major risks for US Arctic security. The most likely outcome would be an Arctic Cold War, with the US, Russia, and China racing to secure control over Arctic waters, resources, and military zones. If the US fails to act quickly, Russia and China could establish dominance over the region, giving them the ability to control key shipping routes and Arctic trade corridors. So the Arctic will play a crucial role in global power dynamics in the coming decades. If NATO collapses, the US will have to deal with growing military activity from both Russia and China in the region, while also trying to hold on to its own strategic position. And whether the US is ready for this challenge is still uncertain. Similarly, another drawback of NATO's dissolution for the US is that Europe may be forced to look for new security alliances, and this is where China comes into the picture. If the US leaves NATO, China could step in, offering closer economic and military ties to European countries looking for new security options. While Europe has traditionally been aligned with the West, China has invested billions across the continent in industries, infrastructure, and technology. Through its Belt and Road Initiative, BRI, China has poured billions of dollars into European countries, funding highways, railways, ports, and energy projects. Countries like Italy, Greece, and Hungary have received large-scale Chinese investments, with China even acquiring a majority stake in Greece's Piraeus port, one of Europe's busiest shipping hubs. Additionally, China's growing influence in Germany's car industry and its investments in high-tech startups have sparked debates about Europe's increasing dependence on Beijing's capital. So if NATO weakens, China could use its economic power to gain political leverage, pushing European nations to cooperate more with Beijing, and at the same time, China also has a strong alliance with Russia, and without US leadership in NATO, Moscow and Beijing could become even closer. This could lead to a new world order where China and Russia challenge Western dominance, expanding their influence not just in Europe, but in the Middle East, Africa, and the Arctic. So if America walks away from NATO, it won't just be leaving Europe vulnerable, it could be opening the door for China to reshape global security in its favour. So the bottom line is clear. It's not that easy for America to simply walk away from NATO without facing serious consequences. While Trump may argue that NATO is a burden, the alliance gives the US global military reach, strategic bases, and strong alliances that would be difficult to replace. Similarly, Europe also cannot replace the United States in the short run. Its armies are divided, its nuclear deterrence is limited, and it lacks the rapid response capabilities that the US provides. So if NATO collapses, it won't just be a shift in military alliances, it will mark the beginning of a completely new world order. And that world order is perhaps already on the cards with Trump back in power. We recently made a video on how a secret pact between the Saudi prince and Trump administration is going to change the Middle Eastern geopolitical dynamics in coming years. You would be seeing that video's thumbnail on your screen. Click on it to watch now. And do not forget to subscribe this channel for more such videos. Take care.